She arrived on the Tuesday stage with one trunk and a letter she would not let out of her hands. You need to understand what that letter cost her to carry. Because what happened next, on a ranch at the edge of everything, in the longest autumn anyone in Cala County could remember, was not the story anyone expected. Not the man who had sent for a wife. Not the town that watched and whispered. Not the woman herself. If you stay with this until the end, you will understand why a life that had been shut down to almost nothing opened again, and why the instrument of that opening was the very thing everyone else had written off. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was standing in the road outside the stage depot with dust on her boots and her chin level, and that letter pressed flat against her ribs. And the man who had come to collect a bride took one look at her and went very still in a way that had nothing to do with welcome. Her name was Marin Voss. His name was Callum Hart. And the thing that bound them before they had exchanged 20 words was a dead man named Orrin Briggs, who had known them both better than they knew themselves. This is the story of that autumn. Callum Hart had come to the Flat River Range 9 years before the Tuesday stage brought Marin Voss to his doorstep, and he had come in grief the first time too, though it had been a different shape of grief. The grief of a man who rode away from a ruined enterprise in the East with $40, a horse, and no particular reason to arrive anywhere. He had arrived at Flat River because his horse threw a shoe in the afternoon, and the nearest smithy happened to be there. And the man who ran the smithy, Orrin Briggs, had looked at Callum's face and at his $40, and at the sky going orange over the mesa, and it said simply, "You look like a man who needs to stop moving for a while." Callum had stopped moving. Over the next 3 years, he and Orrin built what they called the Briggs Hart Spread, though it was Callum's labor that broke the first ground, and Orrin's old deed that made it legal. And in the spring of the 3rd year, which cleaned them both out so thoroughly that they ate salt pork and pan bread for 6 weeks afterward and laughed about it, Orrin was 61 to Callum's 28. Orrin had a wife in those years, a woman named Petra, who died of a fever in the 4th year, and whose death put Orrin into a quiet from which he never fully emerged. Callum had watched that grief, and had understood something about it he could not have named. He had simply begun bringing Orrin coffee at 4 in the morning, and working alongside him until the light failed, and neither of them spoke much about Petra again. But the coffee and the work were a kind of speaking. In the 7th year, Callum fell in love. Her name was Susanna Clare, daughter of the mill owner in town, and she had a laugh that sounded like water on flat rock, and they were married in the April of that year in the small plank church on the east end of Cala. Orrin stood up for Callum at the ceremony and cried without any embarrassment. Susanna moved to the ranch, and she and Orrin developed an immediate friendship built on shared opinions about the correct preparation of sourdough, and their mutual impatience with Callum's tendency to leave his boots. Callum watched the two of them conspire over the kitchen table and thought that this here was the entire world. Susanna Clare Hart died 14 months after the wedding. A fall from a horse on a morning in June, the ground dry and rutted. She did not die at once. She died over 3 days in the bedroom that looked out over the south pasture, with Callum on one side of the bed and Orrin on the other, and the light changing on the mesa through the window behind them. The precise count of what followed. Callum did not leave the ranch for 11 days. He worked from before first light until he could not see, and then he sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood. At the end of 11 days, Orrin put a plate of food in front of him and said, "You're going to eat that." Callum ate it. They spoke of the fence line on the north quarter and the price of beef at the county auction and the well drawing slower than it should. Callum called this simplification. He reduced the ranch to its component tasks and performed the tasks and stopped going into town except for supply runs. Orrin let him do this for 1 year. At the end of that year, Orrin said, once, while they were mending the south fence, "A man who mistakes solitude for safety will stay safe long past the point where safety is what he needs." 2 years after Susanna's death, Orrin Briggs died. He died in his sleep in early November, when the first hard frost had come down over the mesa and the world smelled like cold iron. He left the deed to his half of the ranch to Callum outright properly witnessed. He left a letter. Callum found it in the drawer of Orrin's bedside table, in an envelope addressed in Orrin's careful hand, with a notation beneath the name that said, "Read this when you are certain you need nothing and no one." Callum understood this as an instruction to read it immediately. He sat on the edge of Orrin's bed in the frost-cold room and read it. 2.5 pages covered the ranch, the water rights, the north fence, the well, a small debt to the farrier, the location of certain papers. The last half page was different. It said there is a woman in Harlan Township in the eastern part of this state who is Petra's niece by her sister's line. Her name is Maren Voss. She is 32 years old, and she is a practical person and a careful one, and she has had a hard several years, and she is not getting any younger, nor Callum are you. I have written to her. I have told her about you and the ranch and about Susanna, because she deserved to know the truth of what she might be walking into. I have told her the choice is entirely hers. I have enclosed $20 for her stage fare if she chooses to come. I have also told her that you are not an easy man, but that you are an honest one, and that an honest man properly attended to is worth the effort. I believe this from the first night you slept in my stable, which you did not know I knew about. Do not be a fool. Beneath the letter was a second sealed envelope addressed to Maren Voss in Harlan Township. All it required was a direction to send it. Callum set it on the kitchen table and went about his work and came back to it in the evenings for 10 days. On the 10th day, he rode it into town and put it in the post himself, and then he came back to the ranch and kept working. The reply came in late January. Maren Voss listed 7 questions. They concerned the ranch finances, the nature of the work, the legal terms of any arrangement, whether he intended a genuine partnership or a domestic arrangement, dressed up as one, what he understood about Petra Briggs, and whether he was willing to give her time to form her own judgment before any formal steps were taken. The 7th question was underlined twice. Callum answered every question in 3 plain pages. He said the ranch ran solvent, but not comfortably, that the work was real and demanding, that he intended a full legal marriage and not a labor contract, that Petra Briggs's name was spoken with respect in this house, that if things proved wrong, he would see her return to Harlan Township with her costs covered and no argument, and that, yes, he understood about time and would honor it. Maren Voss replied in February. She said she would come in September. She came in September. The stage arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of September, and Callum was there with the wagon, and Maren Voss was the last to descend. He had the handwriting and the 7 questions, and the even practical tone of 2 letters, which was perhaps useful, because the woman who stepped down was not what the town wanted for its own satisfaction. It had been talking about the hard situation for 2 years, and for the 9 months since word had gotten around that Callum had sent east for a mail-order bride. When Maren stepped down and the town got its first look, a certain satisfaction traveled through the watching faces. She was 32, plain by the county standards, with a wide practical face and a strong build, and no particular graces of dress. She wore a dark serge traveling jacket that had been cleaned but was not new, and her dark hair was pinned with no decoration. And she carried her own trunk without assistance. A woman outside the millinery said something low to the woman beside her, and the second woman's mouth bent in a way that was not a smile. Callum watched Maren Voss walk toward him. He watched her hold her letter against her ribs, and he watched her assess the wagon and the horse, with eyes that knew what they were looking at, and he watched her look at him directly in a way that most people, men or women, did not manage. He said, "Miss Voss, I'm Callum Hart." She said, "I know you're taller than I expected." He said, "Is that a problem?" She considered this with apparent seriousness. She climbed up without waiting for a hand. The drive to the ranch was 11 miles on the river road, and they were quiet for most of it. Callum was quiet because he did not know what to say to a person he had agreed to but not yet met, and Maren was quiet because she was looking at the country with the concentrated attention of someone deciding something. The mesa was red in the late afternoon light, and the cottonwoods along the river were beginning their turn, and the light on the water at the shallow ford was the particular color that belonged only to September in that county. Maren said, "The water's lower than it should be this time of year," Callum said. "Yes," she said, "what's feeding it?" He told her about the creek system on the north slope, the dry summer, the intake situation. She listened and asked 2 more questions. By the time they reached the ranch gate, she had a working picture of the water situation that had taken Callum the better part of his first winter to assemble. He showed her the house. He showed her Orrin's old room, which he had prepared for her separately from his own, honoring the 7th question and its double underlining. She looked at it, set her letter on the bureau, and said, "Where do you need me in the morning?" He said, "First, light. The east fence has a section that didn't survive the August heat. Posts are heaved." She said, "I'll be there." She was there at first light, in canvas work trousers and heavy boots that had seen serious use, and she knew how to set a fence post. Not approximately. She knew the angle of the tamping rod, the correct depth for that soil, the way to read the wire tension by hand before committing the staple, and Callum watched her and said nothing, and the fence was better for 2 sets of hands. They reset 14 posts that first day, and his back was better for the help, and he did not say so, and she did not ask him to. This was the texture of the first week. Work side by side, minimum of words, and the work honest and competent. In the evenings Callum cooked. Marin sat at the kitchen table with a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, and the kitchen held the sound of the fire and the wind off the mesa and not much else. On the third evening she looked up and said, "You're using too much salt in the bean pot," he said. Orrin always said that too. She said, "Who am I to argue with Orrin Briggs?" She had a careful relationship with Orrin's name. She did not invoke it often, but when she did, it was with precision. On the fifth evening, she said, "He wrote me 4 letters in all. Over 2 years. Did you know that?" Callum said he had not known the count. She said the first one was about the ranch, the second was about Susanna, the third was about grief. The fourth was about me, I suppose, in the way a letter. About what a person might do with their life is about that person. She closed her notebook. She said he was a thorough man. Callum said yes. There was nothing else to say. This was the rhythm of the first 2 weeks. The work set the pacing, and there was no shortage of it. South pasture rotation, hay assessment for the winter ahead, 2 calves that had been slow to thrive and needed monitoring. Marin worked all of it without ceremony. On the 8th evening, when Callum asked directly, she told him she had grown up on a farm in the eastern part of the state, stated as plain fact, not complaint and not credential. Her father had died when she was 24, her mother when she was 28. And she had managed the farm for 4 years, until a brother's family came to claim their share of the estate, which was their right. And by the time it settled, she had her portion in cash and no property and no reason to stay in Harlan Township. Callum said, "Orrin told you about Susanna?" She said yes. He said, "What did he say?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He said she was the best thing that ever happened to this land, and that losing her had made you careful instead of hard, and that the difference between those 2 things is the whole of a person's character. He hoped I was careful in the same way, that we might understand each other on those grounds." Callum looked at the fire. He said, "That sounds like him." She said, "Does it bother you that he arranged this?" He said, "It bothers me less than it used to." She said, "Me too, actually." In the 3rd week, the quality of the silence between them shifted. It had been in the first week, the silence of 2 strangers managing proximity. It was becoming something in which both of them could rest without effort, and this shift was more significant than any conversation they'd had. On the 17th day, Marin found in a corner of the root cellar she was reorganizing a flat wooden box she did not recognize. She brought it to Callum that evening. Inside, a set of small carving tools and 2 pieces of basswood, one finished and one roughed out. The finished piece, a small bird, carved with a precision almost shocking from a man whose hands were mostly devoted to fence wire and cattle. He said, "Orrin's. I didn't know he'd kept these down here." She picked up the bird and turned it in the lamplight. She said, "Did he know you knew he carved?" Callum said, "I found him at it once. He put it away and we never mentioned it." She set the bird carefully on the table between them. She said, "That seems like Orrin too." She began carving that winter. Not immediately, but she did eventually, and what she made was different from Orrin's birds. Small practical objects, a handle for a drawer, a prop for the kitchen window, a pegboard for the wall by the door. She paid attention to wood the way she paid attention to everything, with a seriousness that had nothing performative about it, and the objects she made were plain and correct and better than what they replaced. It was in the 4th week of September that Rafe Corbin rode out to the Flat River Ranch the first time. He came on a Thursday afternoon with 2 hired men, the interchangeable large kind he kept about him, and himself pleasant, in the way of men who have never needed to be otherwise, and a document case. Callum. Corbin said he had heard Callum had a guest from the east staying on. Callum said Marin Voss was not a guest. Corbin accepted this with no change in expression, and said he was there on a matter of a legacy obligation. The document case produced a claim that Orrin Briggs had owed a debt to a merchant partnership in which Corbin held an interest, $340, supported by a promissory note bearing Orrin's signature, dated 18 months before his death. Callum read it slowly and twice. He said, "I settled every debt Orrin had. He listed them to me in his final letter. This was not among them." Corbin said, perhaps the old man had forgotten, and that the debt was now assigned to the estate, and therefore to the current property holder. He said he had been patient, but that patience had a natural term. He looked at the ranch with a long, appreciative look that had nothing to do with admiration. He said, "Beautiful piece of land. Good water rights, I hear." He gave Callum 2 weeks and rode off. Marin had watched from the porch. When Callum came back, she said, "What was that?" He told her. She was quiet, and then she said the note was the paper uniform with the rest of the document. Was the signature the same age as the text? He said he had not looked closely enough. She said, "Next time you see it, look." He went through every paper in Orrin's lower chest and document box. He found no reference to any debt to any merchant partnership. He found a journal in which Orrin had recorded every financial obligation of his last 4 years in compressed, meticulous entries. It stopped in late October of the year of his death. There was no entry for $340 to anyone. Callum rode into town to consult Vera Aldous, who ran the County Land Records Office and had been doing so for 19 years, and was the closest thing Cala County had to institutional memory on matters of property and debt. She was 74 years old and had opinions that she delivered without preamble. She listened and said, "Corbin has done this twice before that I can demonstrate, and 3 more times, I suspect." She said Callum had every right to contest the note's authenticity before the county clerk and to require independent verification of the signature, and she gave him the name of a lawyer in the county seat. She said, "Don't wait too long, because Corbin doesn't." Callum rode home and told Marin everything. She listened with her notebook open. At the end she said, "So the debt may be fabricated." She said, "You should write to the lawyer tonight." He wrote that night. Between the threat's first appearance and its escalation, the ranch held its rhythm, and the rhythm had changed. It was October now, the light gold and low, mornings hard with frost. And there was the particular work that belongs to October on a cattle ranch, sorting and trailing and final hay assessment and winterizing the structures, and Callum and Marin moved through it in a partnership that had stopped being careful and started being something else. He noticed things. She was always 10 minutes ahead of where he expected, not from rushing, but from thinking ahead the way a person does, who has managed things alone and cannot afford surprise. She had a habit in the evenings of going to the porch for a few minutes after supper, whatever the temperature, and returning composed in a way she had not been when she went out. He understood it as a practice and had his own versions, and did not ask about hers. She told him one day, at noon, beside a creek on the 12th of October when they had stopped to eat while trailing cattle from the high pasture, that the first time she had read Orrin's letter she had laughed out loud. He said, "At what?" She said, "He described you as a man who leaves his boots in doorways, as though this is a diagnosis. He said, he mentioned that to you." She said, "It's in the first letter. I thought you should know your boots. Preceded your reputation." He ate his bread, and after a moment said, "Are they in the doorway now?" She said, "They were this morning." He said, "I'll speak to them." It was the kind of exchange that has no weight by itself. This was the 42nd day. On the 47th day in the evening, Callum was sitting with Orrin's carved bird in his hands when he understood something. He had been thinking, without meaning to, about the choice Orrin had laid out, not as an obligation, because Orrin had made the obligation optional to the last careful word, but as a separate thing. He set the bird on the table and looked at it for a while. He went to the doorway and said, "Marin." She was on the porch. She turned around. He said, "I want to talk to you about something." She came inside and sat at the table across from the carved bird and looked at him in the direct, undefended way she had, that still sometimes stopped him. He said, "Orrin asked a thing of me and a thing of you." What he asked was reasonable, given what he knew. I've been thinking about whether what I want is because of what he asked or whether it is something else. He stopped. He said, "I think it is something else." It has become something else over the last 6 weeks. And I want to be clear that I know the difference and that I'm not asking you out of any debt to a dead man. She was quiet. The fire made its sounds, and the wind moved around the eaves. She said, "What are you asking?" He said, "I'm asking if you would marry me, not because we agreed to consider it, but because I am choosing it. I want to know if you are choosing it too." She said, "I made my choice somewhere around the fence posts, on the second morning, I think, but I wasn't going to say so because that seemed to be rushing it." She looked up. She said, "Yes." Then she said, "Marin Voss, not Hart," he said. "That's a reasonable condition." She said, "And the boots go inside the door, not across it." He said, "That seems manageable." She said, "Then yes." The fire banked and the wind moved, and the mesa was somewhere out in the dark, being large and indifferent, and everything was all right. 3 days later they rode into Calla and spoke to Judge Emmett Oldys at the courthouse, Vera's brother, 20 years on the county bench, a man of approximate patience and very precise legal knowledge, and gave him the facts, and he married them that afternoon in his office with Vera as witness. Marin kept her name. The marriage was entered in the county record as Callum Hart and Marin Voss, legally wed, Flat River Range, Calla County. Judge Oldys also, in the same sitting, accepted the formal contest of Corbin's note and entered it into the county clerk's record, placing a legal hold on any further action pending signature verification by a document examiner. Vera Aldous shook Marin's hand after she said, "Welcome to this county." She said, "You'll find it improving now that we've had a look at it." Corbin came back on the 21st of October. He came with 4 men this time instead of 2, and a man Callum recognized as Deputy Feller, who served as county law enforcement when Corbin required it to have a face, and who looked, as he always did in these situations. Callum was at the gate. Marin was beside him, jacket on, hands at her sides, standing in the way of a person who has decided something and does not need to keep deciding it. He said something about the domestic arrangement and used a word for it that was not respectful. Marin did not visibly react. Callum said quietly that the domestic arrangement he was referring to was a marriage entered in the county record 8 days ago, verifiable at Judge Aldis's office before he said anything further he might need to answer for in a legal venue. Corbin's expression adjusted. Deputy Feller looked at his saddle horn. Corbin said the note remained a valid claim, regardless of the challenge. Callum said the challenge meant no action could be taken without the court's authorization, which had not been granted, and that he had a copy of the judge's filing if Corbin would like to see it. He went inside. Corbin did not take it. Corbin looked at the ranch with that same appreciative look, and Callum saw, in this second visit, what he had missed in the first, that Corbin was not really interested in $340. He was interested in the water rights. The rights Callum and Orrin had paid $212 to secure were worth considerably more than that now, and there was a pattern to where Corbin's holdings clustered in the county, and water was at the center of it. Callum said this to Corbin, not angrily. He stated it as information. He said, "We both know what this is actually about, and I want you to understand that I understand it because I think it will save us both some time." Corbin said, "The note stands." Callum said the examiner from the county seat would arrive inside 3 weeks, and if the signature was verified, he would address the debt, and if it was not, he would ask Judge Aldis what options he had, and either way, he was not in a position to be pressured into any resolution outside that process. Corbin offered a last pleasantry about liens and winter credit operations. Callum said, "I do understand." Corbin looked at Marin one more time, that assessing look, and Marin returned it with a flatness so total it had something in it like weather. And Corbin turned his horse, and his men turned their horses. After they were gone, Marin said, "He'll try one more thing before the examiner comes." Callum said, "What do you think it'll be?" She said, "He'll approach whoever owns the North Slope about the water access from above. If he gets a foothold above your intake on the North Creek, the water rights become complicated regardless of the note. You should speak to whoever owns that land before he does." Callum rode to the Tesler family on the North Slope that same afternoon. 3 brothers and a father. 20 years on that land, no particular inclination toward Corbin. The eldest brother, Georg, said something about Corbin in plain language that Callum did not disagree with, and said he would let Callum know if anyone came around about the creek. He also sent Callum home with a bottle of his wife's cider, pressed 2 weeks prior. The document examiner came from the county seat on the 9th of November, a small, precise woman named Ostergaard, who spread Orrin's documents and the contested note on the judge's table and examined them for 2 hours. Her written report was unambiguous. The signature was not consistent with Orrin Briggs's verified signature on 6 other documents. The ink of the signature differed in composition from the body of the note, and the paper showed characteristics inconsistent with the stated date. She called it a fabrication in language, more formal than that, but entirely clear. Judge Aldous filed the report. The note was voided. Corbin's claim against the Flat River Ranch was dismissed. The judge also forwarded the examiner's report and the voided note to the county attorney, acting on what he described as his own initiative, a matter outside Callum's hands. But Vera Aldous told Callum about it. Corbin did not come back. Callum did not pretend this meant permanent peace, because men of Corbin's type moved to the next opportunity rather than accept defeat. But the threat against the Flat River was done. November came in with snow on the mesa, and the cottonwoods stripped bare, and the creek low under its skim of ice. There was the particular domestic intimacy of winter preparation, laying in, checking, the small repairs deferred until the urgent outdoor work was done. Marin reorganized the root cellar completely, and the result was a system so logical that Callum, who had been using it for 9 years, had to revise his sense of what logical meant. He told her so, she said. It's just attention. He said, I know. He meant it as appreciation, and she took it as such. She was learning the land the way she learned everything else, incrementally, precisely, by direct attention. She asked about the names of things, the bend in the river without an official designation, the ridge line to the northwest that everyone called by a word from the original inhabitants of that country, a word whose full meaning she asked about carefully. Callum told her what he knew, which was not everything, and she listened and wrote in her notebook and said once, I want to know what things are actually called before I decide what I call them. He held this as a principle of some importance to her. There was an evening in mid-November, snow outside and the lamp low, when Marin was working at the basswood with Orrin's smallest chisel. Not a practical object this time, but a shape emerging from the wood that had something of Orrin's bird precision. Callum was reading a survey document. Without looking up, she said, I think he knew we'd find the box. Callum said, Orrin. She said, yes. He said he was the kind of man who thought ahead. She said, that whatever else happened, at least they'd be in the right house. The shape in the wood was becoming a hand, small and open. He thought about Orrin at 4 a.m. over coffee, and about how the old man had understood something about the necessary work of paying attention and had spent his whole life demonstrating it. The weight of that understanding settled into the room and was not sad. They settled into each other's habits, the way 2 rivers find a common level after joining, not without friction, not without adjustment, but with an increasing ease that was the product of daily honest decision. He learned that she woke before him every morning and spent 20 minutes at the kitchen table in a silence she treated as necessary. And so he made coffee for both of them and left hers on the table and stayed out of the kitchen until she was done. She learned that he needed to work something out in physical movement before he could discuss it, and so when something complicated arose, she gave him the rest of the day before she expected to talk about it. These accommodations were not negotiated, they were observed and extended, and this was the daily work of trust. He visited Susanna's grave on the 22nd of November, which would have been her birthday. He went alone in the early afternoon and was gone perhaps an hour. When he came back, Maren was in the barn checking on the calves, who had fully recovered and were large and obstreperous, and a source of private satisfaction to both of them. Callum described their recovery in somewhat technical detail, and Maren listened and nodded, and neither of them said anything about where he had been. And the silence was not avoidance, but something more like respect for how things that matter do not need to be named to be honored. At the end of November, with the first hard freeze on the mesa and the creek fully iced, and the world simplified into white and brown and the gray of the sage, Maren came in from the evening cattle check and hung her coat on the new peg by the door and said, simply as a fact that had finished forming, Callum said, "I'm glad." She said, "I mean, I want to stay, not in the sense of the agreement, in the sense of wanting." She began taking off her boots. She put them inside the door. She said, "Did you notice?" He said, "I noticed. It was a small thing." He asked her in the second week of December if she still had Oren's third letter, the one about grief, which she had mentioned but which he had never read. She brought it from the small bundle in the bureau drawer, 4 envelopes in Oren's hand, and gave him the third. He read it at the kitchen table while she was on the porch, 2 pages. The center of it said, "Grief is not a thing you get through. It is a thing that gets through you, meaning it changes the passage, and what it changes is either narrower after or wider. And the choice between those 2 outcomes is not one choice, but 1,000 small ones made in 10,000 ordinary moments." He folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. Maren came in from the porch and sat down. She said, "Did it help?" He said he always helped. She said, "Yes." He said he was right about us. She said he usually was about most things. Callum said the boots accepted. She said, no, he was right about those too. And that was that. The kettle was on and the fire was good, and the mesa was outside in the dark, being exactly what it was, and the 2 of them were inside, in the light, being exactly, if they paid attention, find something beyond that. A thing paid attention to is a thing that grows. That is the whole of it. That is what Oren knew, and what the autumn confirmed in its slow and gravity way. That the world will offer you the materials, rough and plain and without ceremony, and what you make of them is entirely a matter of how much attention you are willing to bring, and how long you are willing to stay in the room with the work, and whether you know the difference between a debt discharged and a life fully chosen. Maren Voss knew the difference. So did Callum Hart, Oren Briggs, who was never wrong about the things that mattered, had known they would. A thing paid attention to is a thing that grows. The harvest had been good,